So, no. First question. You and Bernie Sanders are quite obviously the two socialist thinkers that have inspired perhaps the last two generations and radicalized their thinking and praxis. First question, quite obviously, a very direct and simple one, and the one that would make most sense to people. Who do you think would win in a swimsuit competition, you or Bernie?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to take off because you will have another interview coming.
Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. Today, we bring you an interview with the legendary Noam Chomsky, the emeritus professor of linguistics at MIT, currently teaching at the University of Arizona, who joins us to discuss the election and a wide range of topics related to our current political landscape.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for being on the Washington Babylon podcast. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but I wanted to start by talking to you about U.S. politics. I wanted to know how you feel in the aftermath of the Sanders campaign, and if you had any thoughts on why his campaign failed. I mean, at one point, maybe I got overly optimistic. I thought he actually had a chance to win. I think you were a supporter of Sanders. So if you can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but was his campaign, did it go down because of hostility on the part of the media and the DNC, or did he simply not do enough to broaden his coalition from 2016? What do you think happened to the Sanders campaign?
Well, first of all, as you surmised, I was a very strong supporter of Sanders, have been for many years, but I don't think it failed. I think it succeeded and had a remarkable success, in fact. I mean, he's not going to get the nomination. That's not the only thing in the world. He opened entirely new vistas in American politics. He shifted the arena of discussion and debate, what's sometimes called the Overton window, shifted it very substantially. Issues that are now in the center of discussion, like universal medical care, pre-college education, more humane foreign policy concerned with not supporting dictators and monstrous activities abroad. Lots of things that were just not discussed, he's put right into the middle of discussion. And on the wave of the popular movement that he inspired, some very impressive people have swept into office. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example. And what's more, Sanders broke with over a century of US politics. The United States, we have things called elections. But the fact is, as particularly Tom Ferguson has shown in his extensive and by now classic work, they're bought elections. You can predict the outcome of an election for Congress or the White House with remarkable precision, simply by looking at the single variable of campaigns. Ferguson has shown this very powerfully running through 2016. That goes way back. You go back to the 1890s. The most famous, successful campaign manager was Mark Hanna. He was asked, what does it take to win an election? He said, there's two things. The first one is money, and the second I've forgotten. Well, that's the way elections work. Sanders broke with that. No corporate funding, virtually no funding from private wealth, no media support, in fact, media hostility. The central, the parliamentary party, the DNC, did everything they could to kill him in 2016 and today. Nevertheless, his proposals and ideas have very high, in fact, in the most cases, majority support. That's a real triumph. The other thing that he did, and I think the basic reason for the media hostility and establishment hostility is not so much his policies, which are not that radical, the truth, but rather he did something that's very frightening. He organized and inspired a popular movement of people who don't just push a lever once every 4 years and then go home, but are regularly involved in political activism and changing the world. That's scary. According to accepted political doctrine, not on the right, including what's called the left, the citizens are supposed to be spectators of the political system, not participants. I'm quoting Walter Lippmann, the leading progressive public intellectual of the 20th century, and called his progressive essay on democracy. So the population are supposed to be spectators. They're what he called a bewildered herd. Their betters, people like him, the responsible men, have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. It goes on like that. Other leading intellectuals who established the kind of liberal framework for political democracy took the same view. One of the founders of modern political science, Harold Lasswell, also a Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, just like Lippmann, his view was that we should not be confused by what he called democratic dogmatisms about people knowing their own interests. They don't, we do. And therefore we have to use the mechanisms of what in that day were called, frankly, propaganda to control and shape the thinking of the mob, the rabble, so that we run things for the general welfare, of course. That's a dominant view. Sanders' campaign broke with that. Having a participatory party movement which enters into politics and lots of other things. Politics is just a small part of it. That's right. And I suspect that's the core reason why he arouses such antagonism. If you look at his actual proposals, I mean, they're not as radical as he presents them. So take his two major planks, universal health care and free higher education. Practically every developed society has that. Outside of the United States, all developed societies have some form of universal health care. And most of them have free higher education, including the most successful of them, like Finland. Including Germany has it, the most successful capitalist country. And Mexico has it, very high level higher education system, which is free. It's a poor country. So what he's saying is, let's see if we can rise to the level of other societies. I mean, is that radical? In fact, Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't have been much surprised by most of his policies, quite literally. There's been a real regression during the neoliberal period. And it's a little hard to forget what things are like. So, for example, right now, as usual, when they get into trouble, the corporate sector is running to the nanny state to bail them out of their problems. And a number of people have pointed out quite correctly that they created the problems. They've been indulging in an orgy of stock buybacks for the last, during the years of very high profitability. Instead of devoting resources to improving the enterprise, they've been enriching wealthy shareholders and management by buybacks. I mean, and meanwhile, they're stashing away, they're claiming that they really are not US corporations. Apple, for example, has an office somewhere in Dublin with a couple of people, and it's an Irish company, so it doesn't have to pay taxes. Tax havens and stock buybacks aren't, what they steal from the public is not small change. It amounts to the tens of trillions of dollars. Does that have to happen? Actually not. It didn't happen when this was a society still under New Deal principles. Tax havens and stock buybacks were illegal, and the law was enforced. There weren't any. Okay, that was changed in the early 80s by Ronald Reagan. He opened the door saying, do anything you want, following the advice of, among others, Milton Friedman, other luminaries, who said taxation is theft. You should free up corporations to do anything they like. That's called liberty. And what liberty meant was robbing the public of tens of trillions of dollars. So is it utopian to say that that could be stopped? No, it's not utopian to say we should rise to the level of other countries or even our own level in earlier years. Now take the pandemic. Let's go back to that for a minute. Why did it even happen? I mean, in the United States, it took the worst form of any developed country. We can go into the reasons, but it's mainly because of the wrecking ball in the White House, which is just a freak show. But
yeah, we're going to talk about that a little later.
I mean, it's serious, but and so the U.S. is way behind other countries. The only major country, which is so dysfunctional that it can't even provide data to the World Health Organization on the number of cases and the number of deaths. We're just not up to that. But putting aside the United States, which Trump is systematically trying to destroy, take a look at the pandemic crisis altogether. But why did it ever happen? It's a colossal market failure. After it's been known for years that a pandemic is very likely. It was very well known after the SARS epidemic, which was a coronavirus. Steps were, and it was perfectly possible at that point to start preparing for the next one. Okay, in fact, some countries like South Korea Taiwan did so. It's possible to prepare for it, to prevent it from coming again. But somebody has to do it. Somebody has to pick up the ball and run with it. Well, who could do it? One possibility is the drug companies. But the drug companies follow good capitalist logic. You obey market signals. And the market signals tell you there's no profit to be made in preventing a predictable, anticipated catastrophe. You don't make money that way. Okay, so they didn't do it. Then comes a kind of double whammy, the neoliberal policies of the last generation. So we remember Reagan's mantra, the government is the problem, it's not the solution. So the government didn't step in. Okay, we have a double, two forces collaborating to yield a catastrophe. It's not necessary. I'm old enough to remember when polio was a terrible, frightening disease. It was a terrible shadow that hung over everyone. It was cured by a vaccine, Salk vaccine. developed on government auspices, handed out free with no patents. Jonas Salk was asked about patents, said, look, this is public like the sun. Well, that was the United States. It wasn't some utopian society that people are dreaming about. This time it couldn't happen because we're in the clutch of the particularly savage capitalism of the neoliberal era, which has had all sorts of deleterious effects. I don't have to run through them now. And that background is just straight capitalist logic. Do what makes profit, doesn't matter what the consequences are. We're actually seeing this in connection with a far worse crisis. I mean, we'll recover somehow a terrible cost from the coronavirus crisis. That we're not going to recover from the melting of the Arctic ice sheets and the other very dangerous consequences of global warming. And that's, again, a colossal market failure. Not just the energy corporations, which are racing to try to carry out more destructive activities because that's where the profit is, and not just from the Trump administration, which is in the lead, taking pride in being in the lead in racing to the abyss, but for much more fundamental reasons, what are called externalities. For an enterprise, you pay nothing for the costs that you impose on others. Okay, so if you sell me a car and we're paying attention, we make a deal that's good for us, but we don't have to pay for the fact that there's another car on the road.
Right.
There's pollution, there's traffic accidents, somebody has to pay to build roads and so on. That's not our problem. Well, that's a small example. Destroying the environment for human life is a big example. And that's a deep, fundamental market failure. Now, there are ways to deal with it by regimenting capitalism, the way that was done during the New Deal era, pretty much lasting until the Reagan hammer blows. But that's what it's going to take, and it's not happening. Again,
Well,
the US is the worst criminal in this respect.
who is the worst criminal? I'm sorry.
The United States, the worst criminal. In fact, the worst criminal in human history, if we want to be honest about it. I'm speaking of Donald Trump and the entourage of sycophants that he surrounded himself with. Another one today, as you noticed, he kicked out the Inspector General, Pentagon program dealing with the crisis, put in another yes man. Back to American politics, he's dismantling it. I mean, a very striking fact is that he's not sending appointments to the Senate for confirmation. The Senate is supposed to be this great deliberative body that advises and consents. Well, it's been turned into a joke, but they're in particular supposed to confirm appointments. And Trump has gotten around that by simply making temporary appointments at his will, not sending them to the Senate for confirmation. And as you know, he's gradually surrounded himself with a collection of basically sycophants who shine his shoes. And the Republican Party, which used to be a political party, is now very far from that. It's just a party that sits in Trump's pocket, waits to see what he says, and then says, "Thank you, master." But that's destroying American politics. And in fact, in many ways, this dismantling of a functioning political system is going to be a lasting consequence of the Trump wrecking machine.
How so? When you say he's wrecking the political system, I mean, I generally understand what you mean, but I guess how serious is the threat and that he poses? I mean, we have the possibility of him being reelected, of course, as well, which I wanted to talk to you about. But you see a very serious threat to what's left of American democracy from the Trump presidency.
Well, it ranges from the way the government functions, or rather dysfunctions, much broader things. A democratic society is based on some degree of mutual respect among people and some respect for truth and fact. He's tearing all that to shreds, very brilliantly, I should say. He's doing a brilliant job. So take this business of constant lying that the liberal press fulminates about. Glenn Kessler and others count up 20,000 lies, or
right.
I don't remember the latest figure. That's great. For him, that's great. It's a brilliant tactic. Flood the environment, the political and intellectual environment, cultural environment with lies. The very concept of truth disappears. There is no truth. There's just whatever emanates from the White House. And of course, fortunately for him, he has an echo chamber, Fox News.
Right.
Anything he says, they worship and repeat loudly. And it's a kind of an interesting interaction, because that's also the source of his ideas, whatever they are.
Right.
Sees it on Fox and Friends, that becomes the dictum for today. And then they repeat it. And you take a look at the Republican voting base. There have been some studies of what media they look at. Fox News, Breitbart, Rush Limbaugh. That's the reading material. So the very concept of truth and fact disappears. The same is true, I don't know how conscious this is, but his tactic with regard to the pandemic is brilliant. What he's criticized for is that one day he says, "Oh, it's just flu, forget about it." The next day, crisis, 200 million people are going to die. The next day, we're going to go back to work in 2 weeks. The next day, it's a terrible pandemic. And I was the first person ever to notice it and did more than anyone else. All over the map. That's brilliant. It means he's going to be vindicated. He can't fail. Whatever happens, it'll be one of the things that he said. You shoot arrows at a target, randomly hit a target with some of them, and you can pick up those, and the worshipful, adoring political leadership in what's called the Republican Party will echo it. Fox News will echo it, and the mass base that's also worshipful calls him the chosen. He calls himself the chosen person, and they cheer loudly. They'll accept it. So it's I think he's the most impressive confidence man who has ever appeared in the political world. How much of this is conscious planning? How much of this is just intuitive? I don't know, but it's brilliant. It's a brilliant conjuring trick. And the fact is, you take a look at the voting mass that adores him. With one hand, he's telling them, "I'm your savior." They believe it. With the other hand, he's stabbing them in the back. Okay. Just take a look at the legislative program. It's stabbing his worshipers in the back. The main legislative achievement was the tax scam.
Yes.
The corporate sector and the rich. The deregulation. The deregulation is a gift to the corporate sector, but some people suffer. Those who die from pollution and mercury poisoning and destroying the atmosphere. In other words, the population, including his supporters. So it's a great act. Stab people in the back and get them to worship you as your savior. Not many people would be able to carry that off. I should say he's helped not only by Fox News, the echo chamber, but also by the so-called opposition party. Democratic Party just helps him. in every way.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, so
Take,
continue that thought, but also, I mean,
what they've
where
been,
are we left with
take what they've
this?
been focusing on through his term, not the crimes he's committed. You don't hear much talk about his opening the door to opening the way to a devastating nuclear war, which will kill everything by tearing to shreds the arms control agreements. You don't hear a word about that. You hear a few mumbles about the fact that he's dedicated to destroying the environment for organized life. What you hear loud and clear is he tried to pressure another government to harm a leading Democrat, the impeachment hearings. Robert Mueller is going to him. That's what you hear. These are predictable gifts to Trump. I mean, take the impeachment hearings. Everybody knew, everybody, including the people who initiated, that he was going to win. It was impossible that you could find enough integrity in the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, to vote for impeachment, no matter what he did, even if it turned out that he was responsible for 9/11. They'd still say fine, it was the right thing to do. So there was no way for him not to win, but they poured all their efforts into it, nothing else. Same with the Miller thing. Miller's not going to save you. And Trump was just triumphant, undermining the Sanders campaign was another case of it. But the opposition party is just, they may complain a little bit, but they're basically helping him. They're not focusing on the crimes, what he's doing to people, what we've just been talking about. That's way off in the margins somehow. But you can't expect to be a viable political party that way. And the Republicans, pretty much since Gingrich, have just abandoned any pretense of being an ordinary political party. And this is not my judgment. It's a very broad judgment. It's been mostly articulated most powerfully by people like Norman Ornstein, Thomas Mann of the American Enterprise Institute, who simply argued that since Gingrich moved to eliminate any pretense of cooperative parliamentary politics, the Republican Party has become what they call a radical insurgency that has abandoned parliamentary politics. Actually, I think it goes much farther back to Nixon's Southern strategy, other things. But with Gingrich, it really took off, and his successors, Hastert and others. You can see it in the most important issues, things that an opposition party would be focusing on. So take the major issues that we face, that humanity has ever faced. Say, take the climate crisis, environmental catastrophe. You take a look back at I hate to call them a political party, the former Republican Party was a political party. Even as recently as a decade ago, John McCain, when he ran for president in 2008, had a weak environmental planks on his platform. The Republican Party at that point the congressional party was thinking of some limited efforts to deal with global warming. What happened? The Koch energy corporations, which had been pressing the Republican Party for years to abandon this heresy, moved into action, launched a juggernaut, started bribing senators, intimidating others with threats to run alternative candidates, started a huge lobbying campaign, astroturf groups to pound on doors. The Republicans capitulated. They became deniers. The 2016 primary was very dramatic. Every Republican candidate either denied that what is happening, though they knew it was, or then there were the adults in the room, like John Kasich, who liberals admired, who said, yes, global warming is taking place, but we in Ohio, governor of Ohio, we're going to use our coal and not apologize for it. And he's praised as the best of the lot, actually the worst of the lot. But yeah, I know we're destroying everything, but we're going to go ahead and do it. That's 100% of the candidates who were hailed as the pick of the lot. You know, Trump, of course, is way off in outer space. I mean, it's just astonishing. You ask what's happening to the political world, it's collapsing. In fact, all of this, and notice that the Republicans understand very well that they're a minority party. They've understood this for years. The only way they can hold on to power, apart from lying to people and pulling the Trump tactics, is by preventing people from voting. That's their tactic. Take a look at what's happening. Let's say today, okay? I mean, literally today. The Republican primary is taking place, I think, in Wisconsin. The Supreme Court, which is run by the 5 ultra-reactionary, has just, the governor of Wisconsin tried to delay the primary so people wouldn't stand in lines congregating, getting coronavirus. He tried to extend the possibility of absentee voting so you don't have to stand in line. The Robert courts took care of this, banned both of them, said that the primary had to take place right away, even though no delay in absentee ballots, even though they've just barely been sent out. People have barely reached them. The traditional conservative, older Republican voters, they can do it, they'll vote. But the younger people, the people in more difficult circumstances, African Americans, are the ones who are likely to vote Democratic. We can get rid of them. And they're doing it in all sorts of ways. Mitch McConnell, who's in many ways really the evil demon of this movement, has been laboring for years very successfully to pack the courts with young, ultra-reactionary judges, many of whom don't even pass the American Bar Association qualifications. They're not accepted, but pack the courts with them. So no matter what the public wants in the future, they're going to have to follow our ultra-reactionary policies, because the courts will crush anything else. All of that is very serious planning designed to undermine what there is of a functioning democratic system. And it's very serious, has long-term effects.
But where does that leave us? I mean, Joe Biden was also, encouraging people to vote in the primary in Wisconsin today. And what's the Democratic Party's role in all this? Because I definitely agree with you about the state of the Republican Party, but what is left of the Democratic Party at this point as well? And it's hard to predict anything at this point, but I mean, does Joe Biden inspire a lot of confidence as the nominee? Being sarcastic here, but
Joe Biden inspires the expectation that he'll be a continuation of Obama. Basically put things in a holding pattern, give an opportunity for significant changes to take place, not from Washington, but by the kinds of popular movements that Bernie Sanders has helped inspire. instead of crushing them, as Trump may do, and racing towards disaster, as Trump will certainly do, Biden will be sort of keep things pretty much open as they are. I wouldn't expect any major achievements or any major destruction. In fact, I think if his feet are kept to the fire, he might, by popular movements, he might react to them positively. Sanders, one of his successes, I think, which can persist, is to take part in shaping the party platform at whatever kind of convention takes place. May be able to do that. Well, party platforms are usually pretty meaningless unless there are popular movements who demand that they be implemented. And then things can change. We've had plenty of experience with that in the past.
I wanted to ask actually Dr. Chomsky about that and take advantage of your hindsight. You've been politically active and engaged for 80 years now, by my estimate. How do you feel this current political mobilization that we've seen, started by things like Sanders, but also the anti-fracking movement, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, how does that compare to that period during the Depression of the so-called old left and then the new left? What are some differences or some similarities that jump out?
Well, it's different from the Depression. The Depression, remember, there was look back to the 1920s. The labor movement in the 1920s had been crushed by Woodrow Wilson, corporate sector, and others. There's very little left. But in the 1930s, it revitalized, became a major force. CIO was formed. There were major labor actions taking place, including up to sit-down strikes. And remember that sit-down strikes are very frightening to the corporate establishment. A sit-down strike is just one step before saying, look, we don't need the bosses. We can take this over and run the place ourselves. It's just short of that. And such ideas were circulating. There were also political parties, active political parties of the left, in fact, quite a slew of them. There was a sympathetic administration, which was willing, in fact, open to be pressed to carry out significant progressive changes. That's missing today. We don't, and in fact, I'm old enough to remember that the Depression was in many ways a hopeful period. I was a kid, I didn't see much, but my own extended family, first generation immigrants, were mostly unemployed, but they were members of unions, and the unions provided them with a lot. So a couple of my aunts were unemployed seamstresses, but they were an ill group, which gave them a life, even a vacation in the Catskills, meetings, parties, cultural events, educational programs, all sorts of things. It wasn't just labor actions. There was a whole life of activism. Now, we don't have that today. Today is a very depressed period. I mean, the Depression was objectively far worse than the circumstances of most people today. But today we're suffering from something that hasn't happened for a century. Deaths, what are called deaths of despair. The mortality rate is actually increasing. That hasn't happened except for momentarily since the major flu epidemic a century, 1918, 1919. It's concentrated among white working class population, mostly males. And it's huge. It's estimated about close to 200,000 deaths a year. People have just given up. And that's spread quite widely. I'm sure you probably have a lot more evidence of it than I do, but I'm just, flooded with letters from people, often mostly young people, who say, "What's the point of going on? Everything's hopeless. I don't even want to try." That was much less true in the Depression years. At least, I didn't see people in the Dust Bowl. I didn't see migrant workers. But in the circumstances where I lived, say New York working class, there was a sense of hope, a sense of no matter how rotten this is, we're going to get out of it. We're working together. We can find a way out of this mess. The New Deal programs, actually, they didn't put much of a dent in the Depression, but they gave people hope. You could be working in the Conservation Corps doing significant things. There were developments like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which took a very impoverished portion of the country and made it viable and successful through government action. Going to pandemics, I've forgotten whether I mentioned this, but the polio was a very severe threat. I can remember it as being a terror when I was a kid. It was overcome by a vaccine developed under government auspices and given away free, the Salk vaccine. Things could be done. It actually took the war to end the Depression. Huge government action. A fraction of that would be sufficient to deal with to mitigate, maybe control the environmental crisis. But that also inspired commitment and dedication. And in fact, one of the important things that is often forgotten is that not just in the United States, but throughout much of the world, the anti-fascist war gave rise to popular demands for some kind of radical democracy that would overcome the institutional backwardness and horrors that had led to the Depression. That was all over. It had to be beaten back by a concentrated offensive. And here, the United States and Britain, I'm sorry to say, took a leading role. You take a look at when the US armies finally entered Europe in 1943, Spain, and first in Italy, and then up the peninsula going on after D-Day to the rest of Western Europe. One of the first things they did was dismantle the partisan anti-Nazi resistance, which had been, some countries like Italy and Greece had been quite successful, crushed it. And they had developed in many places, especially northern Italy, a cooperative, democratic, worker-based society. That had to be dismantled. And in fact, what was done was to restore the traditional order, including fascist collaborators. And it was very conscious. Leading figures like, say, George Kennan was advising that Germany should be partitioned, and in his words, Western Germany should be walled off, his words, from the Eastern zone, so it wouldn't be contaminated by these ideas about labor activism and worker control and other things that were coming from the East. It's hard to remember, considering what the world turned into afterwards. But this was happening in the latter days of the war and the few years after. And in the United States, the corporate offensive to try to beat back the Democratic upsurge was immediate. The Taft-Hartley bill was 1947. It banned the most effective forms of labor action, like secondary boycotts. Truman vetoed it. It was passed over as veto. After that came a huge corporate offensive to try to get rid of this heresy. Finally succeeded with Reagan and the neoliberal plate. But that, these things can be reconstructed. These are not laws of nature. These are social phenomena that have taken place. We have to remember that the business classes, especially in the United States more than elsewhere, are very class conscious. They're basically vulgar Marxists. They believe in class war. They, of course, invert the values, and they're at it all the time. The labor movement has been slow to understand it. In the post-war period, they thought they could cooperate with the capitalist classes. So unions, UAW and others, under the leadership of Ruther and others, accommodated with corporations. They got a pretty good deal for themselves, but not for the country. And it was a very fragile relationship. As soon as the corporations decided to pull out, it's over. And they were very surprised at that. You may recall that in, I guess it was 1998, President Carter tried to form some labor management committee to deal with economic problems. And one of the people he selected was Doug Fraser, president of the UAW. He refused. He said, I've learned a little late that the business world is engaged in a one-sided class war to crush working people. Thank you. Big insight. And that's what they've been doing ever since they appeared with particular fervor in the United States. But he finally recognized it a little bit too late. And that's happening right now. Right now, the same sectors are trying to shape the post-war world, post-coronavirus world in their interest. And if they're allowed to do it, they'll succeed. If they're not overcome by popular forces, they'll succeed. And this is on an international scale. One of the things that this should have taught us, this coronavirus, is that problems have to be dealt with internationally. And it's really a sordid spectacle to watch individual countries trying to beat each other down to see if we can steal ventilators faster than those guys can. Take a look at the European Union. It's called a union, and we're seeing how much of a union it is. Germany happened to be quite successful in confronting the crisis. It has maybe the lowest death rate in the world. Right next to it, right across the border, northern Italy is suffering badly. Is Germany helping? Take a look. Actually, the Italians are lucky. They can get help from the superpower across the Atlantic, Cuba. So Cuba's sending doctors, China's sending equipment. The liberal democracies are at each other's throats. Well, that's the way to extend and intensify crises. Cooperation and mutual aid is the way to deal with them.
Can I go off of that point you're making into a kind of deeper question?
Yeah.
So I think all three of us agree that the Soviet Union was a mess. And
yes, it was a disaster.
It was a complete mess by no means by the 20s, at least. It was really on a collision course with forces that we saw play out. But, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, I'm not a huge fan of him, and I know you're not, but he did make this interesting point about this concept of internationalism and the idea that in terms of international coordination and conduits for handling disasters, he used the example of Fukushima, and he said basically they were thinking they were going to need to evacuate an entire island at one point, and the most logical point of debarkation would have been somewhere in eastern or far eastern Siberia. But that's a level of international coordination and necessitates a conduit that we don't have at this point. And I know you've been a huge proponent of anarchism, but do you think that there's something in the ideal that the Soviet Union aspired to with that kind of internationalism and socialist internationalism that on the state level needs to be recaptured?
Well, first of all, I don't think anything like that happened. I mean, in the very early days, there was talk about internationalism. But by the time you get into the 20s, Russia, Stalin's Russia, was crushing independent left movements systematically. No time to go through the history. Probably the worst case was the one that really was part of my personal background, was the anarchist successes during the early days of the Spanish Civil War, which were very impressive, but they were crushed by force, led by the Communist Party. Okay, because Stalin was hoping to make a deal with the West, and he didn't want it spoiled by a left popular movement in Spain. And this was systematic. And there was talk about internationalism, but didn't even reach the surface. Just as socialism was, I think the worst enemy of socialism in the modern period has been Russia since Lenin. That's another story. But mutual support and mutual aid is deeper than government. Take a look at unions. Every union is called an international. What does that mean? Well, by now it means almost nothing. Sometimes it means something, like when the longshoremen in California refused to load boats that are going to the vicious dictatorship in Chile, things like that, or supporting the anti-apartheid struggle. So there's an element of internationalism, but it's not just an idle dream. It can be reconstructed. I mean, when global interaction in economic issues takes revised form after the crisis, it could be the real question, fundamental question is, who is going to be the guiding hand? If it's the labor movement, which is not inconceivable, they can be concerned with the rights of Mexican, Chinese, Vietnamese, and American workers and work out arrangements which are to the mutual benefit of these important sectors of the population. Human associations and connections don't end at national borders. In fact, they often ignore national borders and should. We can move to a progressive form of internationalism. In fact, there's even beginnings of an institutional basis for it. A year or two ago, Yanis Varoufakis, who's inspired the DiEM25 movement in Europe, which is the main progressive movement in Europe, Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders issued a declaration calling for a progressive international to counter and overcome the reactionary international that is being forged in the White House. And it's true. All of the most repressive, reactionary states in the world are being formed into a kind of somewhat informal, but often not so informal union under the guiding hand of whoever does the thinking for Trump. He's the spokesperson for it. So let's counter that with a progressive international. It won't be of government, it'll be of people. who may influence people. Actually, just another word on the crushing of the Sanders campaign, despite what I think is its enormous success, lasting success. It's very similar to what happened in Britain at the same time. Corbyn's campaign was also based on policy programs which are very popular among the population, even when Labour crushingly lost the last election. Polls showed that the program that Corbyn stood for and had won a great victory on in 2017 were still very popular among the population. But the whole establishment came down on him like a ton of bricks. Of course, the corporate sector, the parliamentary Labour Party, the liberal press, all the way over to the Guardian, a totally fraudulent campaign about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was used to denounce and attack him. He's a very decent person, but not a political fighter. He didn't react to it effectively at all. There were other things like the Brexit affair, which were in the background. But what was the reason for the hostility, the enormous hostility? Well, my feeling is very likely that the reason was the same as the hostility to Sanders. He was turning the Labour Party away from a collection of Blairite bureaucrats who set policy and determine what happens to a participatory party. And the party grew enormously, enormous explosion as people actually began to be able to participate actively in the functioning of the party. Didn't go anywhere near far enough, never reached successfully into northern England, the collapsing industrial areas, but it was quite effective. And I think it was frightening for the same reasons that the popular movements that Sanders was inspiring were frightening here. The political elites do not want to have people participating in what's none of their business, like making decisions over the nature of the society. We could go into this. There's plenty of literature about it. I've written a lot about it. Others have too, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to take off because you will have another interview coming.
Well, thank you very much. I wish we had another hour. I know you're tired, and but we're really grateful that you were on. And take care of yourself, and we will hope to have you back on again down the road. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.